Well, the theme for VBS this week, and for really all of Cross Trails camps and day camps this summer, was Ready, Set, Go, and we will. And each day had a theme: go pray, go study the Word, go tell the good news, go serve. But this week, our week of VBS, also had something of an unofficial theme that maybe wasn't even known to the children participating or even to some of the volunteers, but to our 4 staff who we blessed at the end of worship last week. The theme for this week became Scooby-Doo. They worked hard. They put in long days. Then they got to share dinner with someone from the congregation, and then usually they put in a couple of episodes of Scooby-Doo to unwind. It got so where their camp director would call from Kerrville at about 9 o'clock, and she would just say, well, how's Scooby-Doo? And she particularly had great fun with the idea that they were watching Scooby-Doo every night, because she put together that there are 4 of them, 2 girls and 2 guys. So immediately she figured out who's Velma, who's Daphne, who's Fred, and who's Shaggy. It was Mike. And pointed out they're driving around in a van together. They show up in this big van, right? The Mystery Mobile. All they need is an anthropomorphic Great Dane and some crazy slapstick soundtrack, and they would be living Scooby-Doo. And of course, a mystery to solve. Scooby-Doo may be known to you, a TV show starting in 1969. So for these counselors, something from the ancient past that they find curious. This television show that took the great genre of the mystery, right, and tried to fit it into 22.5-minute animated kids series. I haven't watched Scooby-Doo in, I'm going to say, at least 3 decades. But from what I remember, there were some misses in that attempt, but maybe also some hits. One thing they got right about a good mystery, though, the key to the mystery is the motive. You know how a mystery unfolds. There are bits of evidence and different suspects, but until it comes together to make a story, until you understand why people are doing what they're doing, then you haven't solved anything. You've got to understand the motive. You can have the eye for detail of Sherlock Holmes. You can have access to the CSI crime lab, but you don't have an answer until you understand the motive. Well, I'm going to suggest to you that the readings we have heard today seek to answer questions of motive. What is faith? How do we recognize it? Where does it come from? So in Genesis, we just get the evidence. In Genesis, we watch the story unfold. We got a little snippet of Abraham's story. It's a bigger story. It starts when God encounters Abraham with a promise to prosper him, to send him to a new land. And Abraham learns that God has a mission to bless the people of the world. And we see Abraham respond. He goes. Other stories add a little bit more and a little bit more to the picture. I was struck by the story Claire Roberts preached on a couple of weeks ago. Very brave. She preached on the Genesis story that week. These 3 strangers visit Abraham, and it becomes clear that God is among them. And the simplest explanation, although it's complicated, the simplest explanation seems to be that it is somehow God in human form and a couple of angels that have visited. And as they're leaving, they talk amongst themselves. And it's quite fascinating. They say, now, should we tell Abraham what we're here to investigate and what we're thinking about doing? And they say, well, yes, I have to tell Abraham. He's my partner. I've made him a partner in what I'm doing. I've got to share what I'm up to and why. And then this story, one of several, The one we heard today, where Abraham continues to get to know God as a promise giver and a covenant maker and a covenant keeper. And we see through his actions what Abraham's response is. And Abraham becomes someone who's living a very curious and distinctive life. Well, then we get the book of Hebrews that comes back to the same story and wants to ask, now, what makes sense of these choices? What makes sense of this life that Abraham lives that's so different from others? What connects all the pieces? What explains the distinctive behaviors we see? What is his motive? Right? We see someone in his 70s and then his 80s and then his 90s, and he is just laser focused on the future. Future-oriented life, propelling him forward. Now that's a little odd. We know that he's been promised a land, and that is what brought him here. He moved across the continent to this new place, but he continues as a renter and a guest and a nomad, and it doesn't seem to bother him that he doesn't own a scrap of this land. That's an interesting detail. And we overhear in today's reading that he is promised to have descendants like the stars in the sky, but he has no children. And then he finally, by the time he dies, comes to have 2 sons, only one of whom seems to be carrying on this blessing and covenant. 1 son. What can make sense of this mysterious behavior? Well, Hebrews says, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And Hebrews says, when you know the motive, then there's this through line, then it makes sense, the choices that Abraham's making. He's living by faith. When you see how his actions in the present are springing from a confidence and in a hope of something not yet realized, then Abraham's motive becomes clear. I have to say, this is a compelling perspective, and I have some experience with this particular kind of detective work, because I end up preaching at a lot of funerals of people who die at different ages and under different circumstances and so on, but we endeavor to tell that person's story. And we start to look at the whole picture, and often we find ourselves asking, now, where did that perseverance come from in the hard times? Where did that ability to bear such sorrow come from? When they had to start over, where did the energy come from? Where did they find direction in the wilderness times in this life? How did they maintain their integrity in the face of temptation? And that faith motive often is the one that fits. It begins to explain a lot. Even in these much more ordinary lives than Abraham's, we see it, the through line, the core motivation. But for us who are on our journey, who are seeking to live by faith, the question for us is, where does it come from? How does it come about? Where do we get it? How does one come to have this assurance of things hoped for and conviction of things not seen? And for that answer, let's do some sleuthing in the gospel reading. Jesus says, have no fear, little flock. Now there's a clue. Perhaps there is something in faith to repel fear. Perhaps faith is the opposite of fear, or the antidote to fear. We learn something about faith. We listen to Jesus. He tells us, sell what you have and give to the poor. There's action here. Faith is proactive and countercultural. It has results, surprising results. It calls for sacrifice. Perhaps it empowers sacrifice. It involves standing with the suffering in tangible ways. Now this is good. We have some clues to go on. Then Jesus tells a story of these servants waiting for their master's return. Faith involves readiness, eager expectation, always looking for God to appear, eyes open for God to act. Yes, this is helpful. He gives us many clues. And that's all true enough. But where does faith come from? Some things, I think every good detective knows this, some don't need to be figured out. Sometimes you just have to listen. You know, when the great detective Hercule Poirot wants to establish a motive, he seems to like to gather the suspects in one room, and in carefully orchestrated ways, he raises the tension until finally it becomes unbearable to someone, and they blurt out, "Here's why I did it." Columbo is known for a little subtler tactic. He just plays dumb, lets others fill in the gaps, or he intentionally makes some mistakes, and people correct him, and pretty soon the truth begins to come out. I think it's hard to beat Miss Marple, the elderly detective who just quietly attends small-town dinner parties and gets herself invited to tea here and there, and then simply listens as others just tell her everything she needs to know. You know, motives are at the core of who we are, and often we're almost looking for opportunities to express them, aren't we? Some things are too important to leave unsaid. And it seems that Jesus doesn't want us having to conjecture and guess about what God's motives are. He just wants to tell us if we'll listen. Have no fear, little flock, for it is the Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Here's God's motive. God delights in giving us gifts, the way you or I might delight in giving gifts to the delight of those we love. God gives us what we need, and often what we want, and what we didn't think we needed, and what we didn't know we wanted. It is God's good pleasure to give us indeed the kingdom. God's delight is to give it all to us. Author David Miller describes the kingdom of God beautifully in this way. The kingdom appears in every love and beauty, in all that is light and goodness, in every act of care and compassion. It is a gracious space of unlimited welcome, where our hearts release their anxious striving and defensiveness, where healing replaces hate, where death holds no fear, where exuberance fills the space once occupied by guilt and shame. The kingdom appears every time love rules the moment. It is God's good pleasure to give us that. So Jesus goes on to tell how those servants, having waited for their master, are now waited on by their master. A story to tell us God delights in serving us, in caring for us. All the way to Jerusalem, Jesus is telling us this message if we'll listen in every way available to him. God never tires of forgiving us. It is God's delight to see us forgiven or healed or comforted or reunited. God, it seems, just really gets a kick out of blessing people. God's motivation is to give us the kingdom. That is the Father's good pleasure. So many people, isn't this true? So many people are looking for all the evidence they can find about God. And trying to figure out God's motivation as best they can. This is us too when we don't listen to what Jesus is telling us, right? We try to figure it out from the evidence. What does creation tell us about the God who created it? Many have tried to sort that out. What do the events of world history tell us, or the events of our time, or the events of our own lives? What do they tell us? What is God's motivation? Can we figure it out? We ask, how does justice figure in, and how is it balanced with mercy? We try to reason it out. Or when bad things happen or hard times come, we try to follow the evidence. Is God testing us? Has God abandoned us? Even maybe just for a while? Is God punishing us? But see, we don't have to guess God's motive. Jesus wants to tell us and show us in every way he can. Jesus wants us to know God's mind and heart completely. When Jesus reaches Jerusalem at the Last Supper, the disciples are getting nervous about Jesus' talk about his time to leave them, he says. And so Philip asks him, well then, just show us the Father. And Jesus says, haven't you been with me all this time? What haven't you understood about this? What I have told you, what I have shown you, it is all so that you could know the Father and see the Father through me. Jesus wants us to know God's mission, God's own heart. And indeed, it comes to the cross that next day to fully reveal the mind and heart and mission and motive of God. As Jesus gives himself completely, there we see it. Gives himself completely for us. That's what God has done and is doing and wants to keep doing. In Jesus' body given for us, in Jesus' blood shed for us, we see it. And then faith is possible. That's where faith comes from. Wherever Jesus tells us the mind of God, wherever Jesus shows us the heart of God, whenever Jesus makes plain for us God's motive, then faith becomes possible. And it begins to show in our actions and our choices as we live our lives out of the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen.